January 17th, 1944, Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The pre-dawn air hung thick with salt and diesel fumes. On the coral beach, a young Japanese infantryman named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto crouched behind a hastily reinforced pillbox, his Type 38 rifle slick with humidity. He had never seen American armor in person, only heard the stories whispered through the garrison. Stories of Sherman tanks grinding through jungle and sand, relentless but predictable. Machines that could be stopped, the officers said, with courage and the right tactics. Yamamoto believed them. He had trained for this. He had memorized the angles, the vulnerable track assemblies, the vision slits. Above him, palm fronds swayed in the tropical wind, and somewhere beyond the reef, the invasion fleet waited in the darkness. What Corporal Yamamoto did not know, what none of the 8,000 Japanese defenders scattered across Kwajalein could know, was that the Americans were bringing something new, something that would shatter every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army held about armored warfare in the Pacific. By early 1944, Japan's defensive doctrine had crystallized around a brutal mathematics of attrition. Island garrisons were expected to bleed the Americans white, to make each captured reef and airstrip so costly that Washington would sue for peace. The Japanese soldier was taught that American forces, while materially superior, lacked the spiritual strength for prolonged sacrifice. This was the core belief. And it was reinforced by early encounters in the Solomons and New Guinea, where American tanks, often Shermans operating alone or in small groups, could be ambushed, disabled, flanked. The Japanese infantrymen learned to see armor as fearsome but mortal. A 47mm anti-tank gun positioned correctly could penetrate a Sherman's side armor. A satchel charge delivered by a determined soldier could cripple its tracks. There was always a method, always a counter. But the American military had been learning too. The M10 tank destroyer was born from a uniquely American philosophy of mobile warfare. Unlike traditional tanks designed for head-to-head combat, the M10 was conceived as a hunter, a nimble, hard-hitting vehicle built to seek out and annihilate enemy armor before it could threaten infantry advances. It mounted a 3-inch gun significantly more powerful than the Sherman's 75mm on an open-topped turret that could traverse a full 360 degrees. Its sloped armor sacrificed protection for speed. Its doctrine was aggressive: find the enemy, flank them, destroy them, move. In the European theater, M10s stalked German panzers through the hedgerows of Normandy. But in the Pacific, where Japanese armor was sparse and often obsolete, the M10 found a different purpose entirely. It became a bunker buster, a fortress killer, a psychological weapon. When the first wave of M10s roared ashore at Kwajalein on January 31st, 1944, Japanese observers were initially confused. The silhouette was unfamiliar. Lower than a Sherman, more angular, the open turret exposing the crew to the sky. Some defenders assumed they were simply a variant, another American improvisation. That assumption lasted approximately 4 minutes. The first pillbox disintegrated under a single 3-inch high-explosive shell. The reinforced concrete, 2 feet thick and designed to withstand naval bombardment, shattered like pottery. The concussive force collapsed the structure inward, burying the gun crew alive beneath tons of coral and rubble. Japanese machine gunners in adjacent positions watched in paralyzed disbelief. They had been told their fortifications were impregnable to anything short of battleship guns. They had spent months pouring concrete, layering sandbags, angling firing slits. Now a single vehicle, operating from 800 yards, had erased their comrades in seconds. Corporal Yamamoto saw the second pillbox explode from his position near the island's radio station. The shell entered through the firing aperture, a shot so precise it seemed impossible, and detonated inside, The blast vented through every opening, a geyser of flame and shrapnel. When the smoke cleared, the structure was a hollow shell, its interior scorched black. Yamamoto's hands began to shake. He gripped his rifle tighter, repeating the mantra drilled into him since basic training. Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. But the words felt hollow now, drowned out by the mechanical growl of engines advancing through the smoke. The M10 crews had discovered something the Sherman tankers already knew, but which the tank destroyers could exploit with devastating efficiency. Japanese fortifications, however formidable against infantry, were designed to resist penetration, not the physics of overpressure. The 3-inch gun fired shells with a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. When that shell struck concrete, even if it didn't fully penetrate, the hydrostatic shock liquefied everything inside. Defenders didn't just die, they were pulped. Survivors emerged from nearby bunkers with ruptured eardrums, bleeding from the eyes and nose, their nervous systems shattered by blast trauma. American infantrymen advancing behind the M10s reported entire defensive lines simply abandoning their positions, fleeing into the interior rather than face the next salvo. But the shock was not merely physical. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to expect American abundance in material. More ships, more planes, more supplies. This was acknowledged, even grudgingly respected. What they did not expect was abundance in innovation. The M10 represented something more disturbing than firepower. It demonstrated that the Americans were not simply outproducing Japan, they were outthinking them. Every few months, a new vehicle, a new weapon, a new tactic. The Japanese military, by contrast, was fighting with essentially the same equipment and doctrine it had used in China 5 years earlier. The Type 97 Chiha tank, Japan's most common armor, mounted a 57mm gun that could barely penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor. Against an M10, it was suicidal. Japanese anti-tank crews trained on 30mm and 47mm guns found their weapons laughably inadequate. A 47mm armor-piercing round might, with luck and perfect angle, penetrate an M10's side armor. But the M10's speed meant it rarely presented that opportunity. It would fire, displace, and fire again before the Japanese gunner could reload. On Kwajalein, the battle lasted 72 hours. By the third day, organized resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets of holdouts, many of them buried in the deepest bunkers, refusing surrender. The M10s prowled the ruins, their commanders coordinating with infantry to mark targets. A flamethrower tank would flush defenders toward an exit. The M10 would be waiting, its gun trained on the opening. It was methodical. It was industrial. It was American warfare distilled to its essence, overwhelming firepower applied with ruthless efficiency. Private First Class James Cartwright, an M10 gunner from Ohio, would later write in a letter home, "We don't even see them most of the time. Just coordinates on a map. The lieutenant says fire, I fire. The bunker goes away. It feels like we're not fighting soldiers so much as demolishing a construction project." I don't know if that's better or worse. For the Japanese, the psychological toll compounded with each engagement. Soldiers who survived an M10 barrage often refused to return to defensive positions. Officers reported widespread incidents of men fleeing inland, hiding in caves, or committing suicide rather than face the tank destroyers again. This was not cowardice. These were men who had charged machine gun nests with bayonets, who had held positions until annihilated. But the M10 removed something fundamental from the equation, the possibility of resistance. A soldier can charge a machine gun because there is a calculus, however grim, of heroism and chance. You might reach the gunner, you might throw the grenade, you might die gloriously. Against an M10 there was no calculus, only waiting for the shell that would erase you and everyone beside you in a millisecond of heat and pressure. The symbolism of the M10's open turret, initially seen as a vulnerability, became its own form of psychological warfare. Japanese snipers trained to target tank commanders found themselves unable to exploit it. The M10 operated at ranges where small arms were useless, and by the time Japanese forces could close the distance, American infantry had already secured the perimeter. The open turret, rather than exposing the crew, exposed the Americans' confidence. It said, "We don't need to button up. We don't fear your countermeasures. We operate beyond your reach." By the time the Marshall Islands campaign concluded in February 1944, American after-action reports documented the M10's effectiveness in stark detail. On Eniwetok, a single platoon of 4 M10s destroyed 17 fortified positions in 6 hours, suffering 0 casualties. Japanese prisoners, when interrogated, repeatedly mentioned the new American fortress killer as a primary factor in defensive collapse. One captured officer, a veteran of Manchuria and the Philippines, stated through a translator, "We can die for the emperor against soldiers. We cannot die against earthquakes." The M10 would go on to serve throughout the Pacific campaign from the Philippines to Okinawa. Its role evolved. By 1945, it was being used to reduce urban strongpoints in Manila, its 3-inch gun blasting through colonial-era stone buildings turned into fortresses. But its greatest impact was not tactical, it was philosophical. The Japanese military had built its doctrine on a foundation of spiritual superiority, compensating for material disadvantage. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was supposed to be the great equalizer. An American tank could be stopped by a brave man with explosives. An American position could be overrun by a disciplined banzai charge. But the M10 and weapons like it revealed that equation as fantasy. American abundance was not just quantitative, more steel, more oil, more bullets. It was qualitative. They had more ideas, more solutions, more ways to kill efficiently and survive doing it. In the ruins of Kwajalein, among the shattered pillboxes and cratered airstrips, Corporal Yamamoto's body was eventually identified by his identification tag, found in the wreckage of a command bunker. He had lasted until the final day, retreating with his unit to the island's center, until an M10 had leveled the structure. In his pocket, searchers found a letter, unfinished, addressed to his sister in Osaka. It read, in part, "The Americans fight like they are building a railroad. We fight like we are defending a shrine. I do not know any more which is stronger." That uncertainty, that fracture in certainty, was the M10's most enduring legacy. It was not the vehicle that defeated Japan. No single weapon ever is. But it was emblematic of the chasm that had opened between the two nations' capacity for war. Japan could teach its soldiers to die magnificently. America could teach its engineers to make death obsolete for their own men while industrializing it for the enemy. The M10 tank destroyer, with its angular armor and thunderous gun, became a symbol of something the Japanese High Command had refused to accept until it was too late, that the war could not be won through sacrifice alone. That spiritual strength, however genuine, could not deflect a 3-inch shell, that the Americans were not coming to match Japan's will with their own, but to bypass it entirely with machinery and doctrine and the cold arithmetic of industrial war. In the end, the M10 was not just a weapon, it was a messenger, and the message was simple: this is what abundance looks like, when turned to the purpose of destruction. This is what happens when a nation that can produce 1,000 solutions chooses the most efficient one. You cannot fight this with courage. You cannot outlast it with endurance. You can only watch it erase you, bunker by bunker, island by island, until there is nothing left to defend. The tank destroyer crews never spoke of their work in such terms. They spoke of targets and ranges and ammunition counts. They complained about the heat, the maintenance, the quality of field rations. But in the space between their mechanical efficiency and the terror it provoked, a truth took shape, one that would outlast the war and define the century to come. Freedom, in the end, had sent its machines, and the machines were undefeated